The silent horror that unfolded in the basement of an ordinary house in Austria is a story that challenges the very limits of human understanding. An account of imprisonment and abuse that stretched for more than 2 decades, with the victim, Elisabeth Fritzl, and her tormentor, her own father, Josef Fritzl, as its main characters. The setting was the quiet, hitherto undisturbed town of Amstetten, Austria, where, in 2008, the veil of normality was abruptly torn. A young woman, visibly frail, appeared at a local hospital, accompanied by her severely ill daughter. Her origin was a mystery, her identity unknown, and her presence immediately raised a series of questions that no one could answer. The enigma of that woman and her daughter was only the tip of the iceberg that, upon investigation, revealed a secret that had lain, literally, buried for 24 long and cruel years. It was the kind of heinous plot that resembled the darkest and most unimaginable storylines of a psychological horror film, but this time, there was no trace of fiction, not even the outline of a script. There was only a brutal, cold, and absolutely real truth, impossible to be conceived by the mind. A woman, presumed missing for more than 2 decades, had spent all that time confined, held prisoner in the cellar of her own family home, right under the noses of the entire neighborhood and the authorities. Her name was Elisabeth Fritzl, born on April 6, 1966 in Amstetten, and her saga would become one of the most disturbing, painful, and shocking cases in modern criminal history, a living testament to human perversity. Elisabeth was the 4th of 7 children born to Josef and Rosemarie Fritzl. On the surface, the family maintained an image of bourgeois perfection, a well-kept house, hard-working parents, and children who appeared educated and disciplined. However, as often happens in cases of systemic abuse, the impeccable facade concealed a deep and treacherous darkness, difficult to perceive by outsiders. Josef Fritzl was the personification of a strict, authoritarian, and obsessively meticulous man. With a background in electrical engineering, he possessed remarkable technical intelligence, but he used it to exercise an iron grip of control, often violent over his family. His discipline, especially towards the women of the house, was almost military in nature. No one dared to contradict him. No one dared to question his decisions, and everyone, particularly his wife Rosemarie, lived in a permanent state of fear and obedience. Elisabeth grew up in this toxic environment, developing a quiet and markedly timid personality. She found refuge in simple passions like music and drawing, and dreamed of a life of freedom, imagining herself as a flight attendant. However, within the walls of the house, her voice was non-existent, and her will was irrelevant. Josef was the arbiter of all decisions, even the most personal and intimate ones. Years later, the extent of his depravity came to light, revealing that since the age of 11, Elisabeth had already been a victim of abuse by her father. The acts were committed in absolute secrecy, under a mantle of relentless threats, through constant manipulation of her will and the terror instilled. No one, neither within the family nor among the neighbors, ever dared to intervene. And the reason was simple. Josef Fritzl was a respected member of the community, seen as a hard-working man, a dedicated father, and proud of his children, whose public image was untouchable. His daughter, in reality, was already living a form of emotional and psychological imprisonment long before she was physically confined. Upon turning 15, Elisabeth attempted what would be her only documented rebellion. She ran away from home, seeking anonymity in Vienna, where she found a job in a cafeteria. She waved the promise of a life far from her father's oppressive shadow. But Josef, with his relentless determination, tracked her down. He convinced her, through tactics of emotional manipulation and empty promises, to return. From that fateful moment, his dominance over her became complete and overwhelming. In 1978, when Elisabeth was just 12, Josef had begun an ambitious and sinister construction. What he claimed was an air raid bunker beneath the house. Over the course of nearly a decade, he meticulously dug the subsoil, installing reinforced doors, manual emergency ventilation systems, and skillfully concealed electrical mechanisms. No family member had precise knowledge of what was happening down there, and only Josef held the key, both literally and figuratively. Almost 10 years passed until the dungeon was complete. It was a massive structure of concrete blocks, made up of narrow corridors and tiny rooms, without any windows, without any access to natural light or the outside world. An armored door, equipped with an electromechanical lock and a secret code, sealed the entrance. To all appearances, Josef claimed it was a security measure. In reality, he was finishing the construction of a perfect prison, a dungeon for his own daughter. The day of doom arrived on August 28, 1984. Elisabeth was 18, had finished a vocational course, and was planning to move out to finally achieve her freedom. That morning, her father asked her to help him carry a door down to the cellar. This was the last moment Elisabeth was seen as a free person. Josef drugged her using chloroform, dragged her lifeless body into the dark bowels of the house, closed the heavy hatch, and sealed her off from the world. From that instant, Elisabeth Fritzl ceased to exist for the outside world, falling into enforced invisibility. For 24 uninterrupted years, she lived confined in that secret cellar, without windows, without the feeling of the sun's warmth on her skin, and without human contact other than her captor and the children he forced her to have. Elisabeth awoke in a tiny room with damp, moldy walls, dimly lit by a single incandescent bulb. The door was made of steel, and the interior had no opening or safety mechanism. Escape was a physical impossibility. Initially, she clung to the vain hope that her father would release her the next day. Then, she thought the family or the police would look for her. But the hours dragged on, turning into days, weeks, and finally, years of terrifying silence. No one came. Josef came down to the prison every day, or sometimes every 2 or 3. He brought the meager provisions, food, water, a blanket, and performed the abuse. He warned her that any attempt to scream would result in electrocution by the electrical system, which, according to him, ran throughout the cellar. He assured her that the house was completely soundproofed and, worst of all, threatened to kill her mother and siblings if she tried anything. Elisabeth, in a state of total isolation and absolute psychological terror, saw no alternative but submission. Weeks solidified into months, and months accumulated into years of darkness and despair. In 1988, she gave birth to her first child. The delivery was performed completely alone, on the dirty floor of the dungeon, without any medical assistance. Josef provided her with only a towel and scissors, nothing more. In total, Elisabeth gave birth to 7 children during her long captivity. 3 of these children were raised with her in the cellar, living the same life of subterranean horror. The other 3 were taken to the surface by Josef, who presented them to his wife and the world as abandoned children who had been left on the doorstep of the house. To the authorities, Josef invented an elaborate and meticulous story, claiming that Elisabeth had joined a radical religious sect and, therefore, could not take care of the children. He even convinced social services to allow him and Rosemary to legally adopt these children, in an unbelievable display of manipulation and control. The city of Amstetten never suspected the nightmare that was unfolding beneath the Fritzell house. While the surface maintained the image of an exemplary family man, the cellar was a daily hell. Elisabeth, despite everything, devoted herself to taking care of her children in the best way possible. She taught them to read and write, to speak, and they played with the few objects they possessed. From time to time, Josef would bring them an old television, some used toys, or blankets. But the control he exercised was total and relentless. He would become furious if they made noise, and did not hesitate to assault Elisabeth if she showed disobedience, keeping her in a state of perpetual submission and constant fear. On some occasions, during intense storms, the cellar door would be blocked for long hours, and on others, the precarious ventilation system would simply stop working, suffocating the entire family with a lack of oxygen. They were on the brink of death on multiple occasions, but Josef remained unyielding in his cruelty. The years advanced mercilessly, and Elisabeth watched her children grow up, never knowing the feeling of the sky, the warmth of the sun, freedom, or friendship. She told them fantastic and imaginary stories about the outside world. But deep down, she feared they would never be able to go out and see it. The turning point, the crack in the prison wall, occurred in April 2008, when one of the children raised in the cellar, Kerstin, then 19 years old, fell gravely ill. Never having seen the sunlight, her immune system was desperately weakened. Kerstin began to suffer convulsions and oral hemorrhages, and her condition quickly became critical. Elisabeth implored her father to take her to a hospital. Initially, Josef vehemently refused, fearing that exposing the young woman would raise unanswerable questions. However, Kerstin's health deteriorated to a point where denial was no longer a viable option. On April 19, 2008, Josef Fritzl took Kerstin to the Amstetten hospital, maintaining the farce that the sick young woman had been left on his doorstep. The doctors were alarmed by her deplorable condition. She was malnourished, pale, and barely able to communicate. Questions began, and Josef had no coherent answers to give. Meanwhile, Elisabeth pleaded with him to let her go to the hospital to explain the situation, a golden opportunity for her release. Josef hesitated for days, tormented by the risk of exposure. Finally, on April 26, 2008, after 24 years of captivity and darkness, Elisabeth Fritzl stepped back into the outside world. She did so under a terrible condition, promising to maintain the false story her father had ordered her to tell. But upon arriving at the hospital and confronting the reality of the situation and the skepticism of the medical staff, who suspected that something was deeply wrong, the truth prevailed. The police were notified, and Elisabeth was interrogated in secret. Initially, she repeated the sect story, but when the agents guaranteed her total and unconditional protection for herself and her children, the dam of lies broke. With a trembling and choked voice, she told the whole truth: the kidnapping by her own father since 1984, the life of seclusion and continuous sexual abuse in the cellar of the family home, the 7 children conceived in that hell. On April 27, 2008, Josef Fritzl was finally arrested. At first, he vehemently denied everything, claiming that Elisabeth was a liar who had invented the story to punish him. However, confronted with the irrefutable evidence, the children's DNA test, the doctor's detailed reports, and most importantly, the precise description of the cellar, he crumbled and confessed to the crime. The news exploded with a deafening force in the local media and then throughout the world. It was unimaginable. How could a human being have been held captive for 24 years in the heart of an ordinary residential neighborhood? How did Josef Fritzl manage to build and maintain a secret prison, raise children in total concealment, and sustain a double life for so long, deceiving everyone? The Fritzl house was immediately besieged by eager journalists. The Austrian government ordered a rigorous internal investigation, questioning the police, social services, and schools. Everyone desperately sought to understand the dimension of this failure and the level of concealment that had been possible. The shocking images of the cellar, with its low ceilings, damp mattresses, suffocating corridors, and the total absence of ventilation, circulated around the globe. The horror was palpable, and no one could look away from that monstrosity. The trial against Josef Fritzl began on March 16, 2009, in the city of St. Pölten, Austria. He was charged with an extensive and serious list of crimes, including kidnapping, rape, enslavement, incest, and the heaviest, murder by negligence. Yes, because one of Elisabeth's children, a baby born in the cellar, died shortly after birth due to lack of medical assistance that Josef refused to provide. The newborn's body was coldly incinerated in a furnace. During the judicial process, Elisabeth appeared in person, but refused to testify in front of her father. Instead, her testimony was recorded on video. Watching the account, Josef, unable to hold her gaze, shrank into his seat. In the middle of the trial, he pleaded guilty to all charges. On March 19, 2009, Josef Fritzl was sentenced to life imprisonment, with no possibility of parole. He was admitted to a maximum security psychiatric prison. He was 73 years old. His fate was sealed forever. Following the traumatic liberation, Elisabeth and her children were taken to a protected residence in a strictly confidential and secret location. There, they began a long, slow, and agonizing process of physical, emotional, and psychological recovery. The first weeks were extremely difficult. The children born in the cellar had no notion of what a traffic light, a tree, or the blue sky was. They were terrified of open spaces, walked with exaggerated caution, and did not understand many common words. Teams of doctors, psychologists, and therapists worked tirelessly with them, day and night, seeking to reintroduce them to the world. Elisabeth, little by little, regained the ability to trust people and communicate openly. She reunited with her mother, Rosemarie, although the relationship was marked by deep and persistent tension. Many wondered how it was possible that the mother did not know what was happening in her own home, but no conclusive evidence ever emerged to prove her involvement or knowledge of the crime. Over the years, and as a security measure, Elisabeth changed her identity. Today, she lives under a different name in a location that remains unknown to the general public. She managed to form a new partnership with one of the therapists who helped her in her rehabilitation process and, in part, managed to rebuild a life that resembles normality. She is said to be an extremely protective mother, that her children attend school, and that she strives to keep them away from media exposure. However, the emotional scars and deep traumas remain indelible. The case of Elisabeth Fritzl remains an open wound in the recent history of humanity, not only because of the unimaginable suffering she endured at the hands of her father, but for what it symbolizes: the systemic failure of an entire society to protect a child. For 24 years, no one heard her cries, no one suspected that double life, no one thoroughly investigated the forced disappearance. Josef Fritzl did not act under a sudden fit of madness. He meticulously planned every step, built the perfect prison, controlled every narrative, manipulated institutions, and managed to deceive everyone with calculated coldness. But as always happens with the deepest and darkest secrets, the truth came to light, tearing away the veil of hypocrisy. Elisabeth Fritzl survived against all odds, and although no one can give back the stolen years of her youth and freedom, her story has become, ironically, a powerful symbol of resilience, resistance, and justice, even if delayed. Her testimony echoes as a grim reminder that hell is not always in a distant place, but can, at times, begin to be built right beneath our own feet.